Governor Northam made a reference to the history of slavery in the Commonwealth during his CBS interview, but he didn't call the first Africans to land on Virginia's shores slaves. Take a listen.
Well, it has been a difficult week, and you know, if you look at Virginia's history, we're now at the 400-year anniversary. Just 90 miles from here, in 1619, the first indentured servants from Africa landed on our shores in Old Point Comfort, what we call now Fort Monroe. And while in 1619, the first indentured servant, the first indentured servant, the first indentured servant, the first indentured servant.
Could comments like that affect his support among Virginians?
Virginia undoubtedly has a very complicated 400-year history of racial division, and Virginians will tell you they don't like to be reminded of that past. And in this last week, they were reminded of the divisions in the not-so-distant past. If you listen to Governor Northam in that interview with CBS, you heard a man who's not a polished politician speaking directly to Virginians, to the people who elected him to office. This is not a man who's running for national office. I spoke with one politically active Virginia voter today who explained that he saw this as a poor choice of words by the governor, really an unartful way of using less offensive language to make a point. The governor has been consistent in his language in the past couple of days, saying he is trying to help the people of Virginia move on from this difficult week. And it seemed to this voter who I spoke to that the media at this point is parsing words in a way that the average Virginians aren't.
Shalom. All praises to the Most High. Allah Jawana. Wakan Tanka. Yahweh. Alright, so just wanted to show basically that first, that governor telling you straight up what these first so-called Negroes that came into Jamestown, who they really were. They weren't slaves, they were indentured servants. Again, indentured servants. You saw how the news broadcasters at the end try to make them sound bad, and like all Virginians are pissed. They're talking for the whole state of Virginia. So if you're in Virginia, are you pissed because he said that? That's what they're saying. They're saying that you guys are all pissed over there because he reminded you of those times. All right, so he was just talking the truth, and I'm gonna show that is actual historical facts. That's what we're gonna show. Thanks for being here again, family. I've been wanting to actually discuss this subject and topic for more than a year now. And I think we're ready. I think that we know how to dodge the hijack. And you are the American Indian, the so-called Negro, the colored, mulatto, black, African American, so-called. All right, you've had many tags and classifications. All right, but you know that you're home now, right? And your grandma was right. Your grandma was right. So, was it slave or was it indentured servant, or was it both? What does the historical record tell us? We're gonna dig into this in the next 2 to 3 videos. I have an article I have been holding for more than a year that will help bring some historical light to this subject. It's called The Illegal Beginning of American Negro Slavery, along with many other legal and historical primary sources, alright, that are gonna help, kind of like break the spell, alright, from this fictional movie roots. Alright, so now we're in this book. Alright, it's called Judicial Cases Concerning American Slavery and the Negro, edited by Helen Tunnicliffe Chattel. Alright, volume 1. There's 5 volumes. This is volume 1, and these are from the cases from the courts of England, Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. Alright, Washington, D.C., published by the Carnegie Institution of Washington, 1926. Alright, and it says here, right in the introduction, it says Virginia. The most interesting matter contained in the earlier part of the following body of extracts is found in those cases which have to do with the beginnings of Negro slavery and the end of Indian slavery. All right, so that's your own hijack right here. I hope we've shown in the last several videos who they talking about when they're talking about Indian, right? So Indians did become Negroes eventually in the census, right, in the paper genocide. We're going to continue to show you this, but I hope you already know that. All right, so what do they mean? The beginnings of Negro slavery and the end of Indian slavery. They just mean like a status change, like you know what I mean? This is when they erased you. Those cases are so scanty, are involved in such obscurity, and are connected with such a maze of statutes. That's what I'm just saying. It's just saying it better, right? That they require illumination before they can furnish it. The texts need a commentary. And since these cases come early in the chronological order of arrangement, the first part of this introduction is of that nature. To write the history of slavery in Virginia in the 17th century is like putting together a picture puzzle when many of the pieces are missing, like reconstructing a Greek vase from a few shards. Others may fit the fragments in a different fashion. You see all the trouble they go through? All right, or are they just bullshitting? The servant, all right, it says number 1, so let's see what it says. The term, number 1, the term servant was used to designate anyone who rendered service, the laborer as well as the household servant, all right? So that's what they mean by servant. It says problem, or rather the problem of service. In the early colonial days defied solution, but necessity caused 9 or 10 varieties of servitude to be evolved in Virginia. Most of them existing in the other colonies also. These varieties are arranged approximately in order of social precedence were the white indentured servants, all right, the white servants without indentures, of whom there were 2 classes, those who came voluntarily and those who came involuntarily, of which latter class were the men, women, and children who were spirited away, those who left their country for their country's good, and probably the duty boys. The Christian Negro servants, whatever that means, Indian servants, mulatto servants, these last 3 are just talking about American Indians, whose servitude was the penalty for having a white mother and an Indian Negro or mulatto father, or after 1723 for being descended in the maternal line from such a combination of ancestors. Indian slaves, Negro slaves, most of these varieties existed side by side in Virginia in the 17th century. Let us hope for the sake of the owners that no one plantation held them all, but the last possessed the germinal potentiality of a certain mustard seed, outstripped the rest, and waxed a great tree, while the others like saplings perished in its shade. In what order did these varieties emerge? Again, we're still in judicial cases concerning American slavery and the Negro. And it says here, the penalty sounds certain, severe, and calculated to deter truancy in a community acquainted with slavery, but meaningless to one which knows it not. The word slave is not defined. It is taken for granted that its connotation is obvious to the colonists. Yet where could they have learned in 1618 what service it implied? For they were Englishmen. If slaves were a novelty to them on that August day in 1619, when, as Master John Rolfe, all right, listen to this, John Rolfe relates, came in a Dutch man of war. A Dutch man of war, they're talking about a ship, that sold us 20 negars. All right, they're trying to say Negroes, and sounds like Nagas, all right, but they mean, people of dark skin, so-called Negroes. Even then, the Virginia colonists did not learn the ways of slavery from those 20, for though they had been slaves among the Spaniards, their capture by the Dutch frigate, cruising piratically among the West Indies, meaning they were pirates, right? They got these from the Spanish ship. They didn't come from Africa, all right? Pay attention. had changed their status to something indeterminate and transitory, which faded out or merged automatically and, as it were, cinematically into servitude, analogous to that of the indentured white servants. When they touched Virginia's soil, the Dutchship had been a godsend to them. All right, so you heard that? So these first so-called 20 negars, as they call it here, and in other accounts, odd Negroes or odd Africans, did not come directly from Africa. They were taken from a Spanish ship in the West Indies, and it was near Veracruz, very near Veracruz, Mexico. All right, you got it from the Saint John Bautista ship, and I haven't been able to find any correlation that that ship had Africans in them, because we all know, and I've shown you what and who the Spanish and Portuguese were enslaving, who they were putting in ships and taking to their colonies. It was American Indians. All right, I've shown that, and go check out the past videos. So this Dutch ship, so-called Dutch ship, we're gonna see what it really was, had been a godsend to them, it says here. All right, so we're in the Encyclopedia Virginia.org website, and it says here, Indentured Servants in Colonial Virginia, contributed by Brenda Wolfe and Martha McCarty. And I guess this is a contract, right? You're gonna see what it indentured servants, basically a contract. I guess this is a historic one right here. All right, so let's go back. All right, so let's just read here real quick what so we can learn what indentured servant was and is, and we're gonna get different versions of it, right? So this is again in the Encyclopedia of Virginia, and it says indentured servants were men and women who signed a contract, also known as indenture or a covenant, by which they agreed to work for a certain number of years in exchange for transportation to Virginia, and once they arrived, food, clothing, and shelter. All right, so you see transportation to Virginia. So they want us to assume they're talking about Europeans. You know, it doesn't really specify from where, right? But they're gonna, you know, we're just, I guess in this article, they're just gonna talk about Europeans, or, you know, it doesn't say if they're white or more, you know, what kind of Europeans were coming. All right, so that's your own hijack. So it says adults usually served for 4 to 7 years, and children sometimes much longer, with most working in the colony's tobacco fields. Yeah, in the plantations, right? In tobacco plantations. Europeans working as indentured servants, right? Alongside the so-called Negro, with a long history in England. All right, because this is what they brought over here. They were practicing this type of stuff in England. We're going to read more into that. It says indentured servitude became, during most of the 17th century, the primary means by which Virginia planters filled their nearly inexhaustible need for labor. That's how they filled these plantations, all right? At first, the Virginia Company of London paid to transport servants across the Atlantic, but with the institution of the head-right system in 1618, the company enticed planters and merchants to incur the cost with the promise of land. All right, so I guess they promised them land after they were done. As a result, servants flooded into the colony, servants, not slaves, where they were greeted by deadly diseases and often harsh conditions that killed a majority of newcomers and left the rest to the mercy of sometimes cruel masters. The General Assembly passed laws regulating contract terms, as well as the behavior and treatment of servants. Besides benefiting masters with long indentures, these laws limited servant rights, while still allowing servants to present any complaints in court. By the end of the 17th century, the number of new servants in Virginia had dwindled, and the colony's labor needs were largely met by enslaved Africans. Dodge the hijack. All right, so we're not done with this book. All right, we're here again. It says here, Studies in History, Economics, and Public Law, edited by the Faculty of Political Science of Columbia University. All right, and this is the title of the book, which is Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States by Almond Wheeler,
Lauber, PhD. All right, this is from Columbia University, again, 1913. All right, so now we're in chapter 9 of this book. It's called Property Relations. All right, Property Relations. Though the practices connected with the institution of Negro and Indian slavery in the Spanish colonies were known to the English colonists, yet at first the latter did not see fit to impose the status of slavery upon the Indians brought into the colonies by way of trade with the Spanish islands or otherwise, but were content to retain possession of the services of their subject Indians without taking possession of their persons through legal declarations imposing the status of slavery upon them. All right away. What are they telling us? They're telling that, you know, these first English colonists, when they were setting up their colonies and getting, or whatever they call trading, or whatever, but they were buying Indians off the Spanish, right? They were selling, enslaving Indians and selling them to the English colonies, right? I've gone over this already. We already know. Again, the Spanish were enslaving American Indians mostly. I would say at least 95% of the time, you know, and not Africans. And so they would trade in these with the English. The English was like, all right, well, we don't want to, you know, I guess as they're being politically correct here, call them or declare them official slaves. They just want their services, right? What they're good at, whatever they are, farming, you know, you're a mechanic, whatever. You're a teacher, you know, whatever your service is, that's what they were employing. Because the Spanish had this almost a similar thing, even though it was basically almost slavery, with how they were treating them, but they had their encomienda system, which was a type of indenture as well. And so, you know, the English right here, they're beginning this book letting you know, again, let me just repeat that part. It says, but were content to retain possession of the services of their subject Indians without taking possession of their persons through legal declarations imposing the status of slavery upon them. Such Indians were held in the status of servitude. Such Indians were held, your ancestors, so-called Negroes, were held in the status of servitude, a condition which stood midway between freedom and absolute subjection, right? In between, either or, and which was the historic base upon which slavery, by the extension and addition of incidents, was constructed. Slavery was constructed based on this status of servitude between freedom and absolute subjection. It could have gone either way for you, and most of the time it went absolute subjection, or chattel slavery as they call it. All right, for life. All right, for life. The right of ownership of the services of both Negroes and Indians was, after all, what the colonists most desired and appeared to promise satisfaction in this instance, as it had in the case of the white indentured servants. Remember, there was white indentured servants too. All right, so again, but listen to what they're telling you. So the right of ownership of the services of both Negroes and Indians, all right, Negroes and Indians, it's all the same. After all, what the colonists most desired and appeared to promise satisfaction in this instance, as it had in the case of the white indentured servants. They had, you know, Europeans over here as well, you know, doing their time for coming over to America. They had to do an indentured servitude for like 7 to 10 years. Indian servitude not only preceded Indian slavery. Again, Indian servitude, so-called Negro, Indian, so-called Negro servitude, not only preceded Indian or colored, right? They classified you as colored or Negro slavery, but even continued after the institution of slavery was fully developed. This is true of most, if not all, of the English American colonies. All right, this was going on in all of their colonies. All their colonies practiced this before they, you know, I guess legalized slavery or created their chattel slavery. Prisoners of war, all right, because you were Indian American indigenous people, Niji. You were free to the land. That was everybody's, right? The land, nobody owned the land. You were free to roam. All right. So they took you in captivity. They made you a servant, eventually slave, eventually, right? In parentheses, and now, you're a POW. You're a prisoner of war, right? It was war declared upon you. Do you know the history of the U.S.? It is certainly true of Maryland, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. Statutory recognition of slavery in general by the English American colonies occurred as follows. All right, so again, when they started recognizing statutory slavery, all right, so it says in Massachusetts it began in 1641, all right, by Connecticut in 1650, by Virginia in 1661 in Virginia, by Maryland in 1663, by New York and New Jersey in 1664, by South Carolina in 1682, by Pennsylvania and Rhode Island in 1700, by North Carolina 1715, and by Georgia in 1755. But the legislation of these dates did not always include the subject Indians. When such was the case, however, according to a strict legal interpretation, any subject Indian, if enslaved, had the right to demand his freedom from the colonial courts, such as an instance existed in the case of Virginia, where the acts of 1655 and 1661 specifically forbade Indian slavery and guaranteed to the subject Indians all the rights of servants. The recognition of Indian as well as Negro slavery by customary law came somewhat earlier than by statute law. With the extension of the period of servitude to a life term, all right, listen to that. With the extension of the period of servitude to a life term, the change from servitude to slavery was practically completed so far as customary law was concerned. You're hearing what they did, right? Only the enactment of legal provisions sanctioning the change was necessary to complete the process. They were already practicing that. That's what they're trying to tell you. All right, so eventually they made it law. They did legal provisions sanctioning the change. All right, so they can complete the process. The common use in subsequent law of the terms servant for life, perpetual servant, all right, dum diversus. What are we talking? The doctrine of discovery. What are we talking about? Perpetual servitude. That's what the Pope said too. Gregorio and Alexander, perpetual servitude. Go take all their lands and kingdoms, their dukedoms, principalities. Go take all their gold. Make them perpetual servants. Dum diversus, until we make a change, right? Again, the common use and subsequent law of the terms servant for life, perpetual servant, and bond servant as synonymous with the term slave. All right, they combined all those adjectives or descriptions or tags, legal terms they had for you, and they made them synonymous with slave. Shows how little change was really affected in the condition of the servant, so they made it in paper because they were already practicing that in life. That's what they're trying to tell you. Such change consisted chiefly from the standpoint of the master in the extension of his right to service, and consequently in the extension of his obligation of protection and maintenance, and what was still more important, in the acquisition of the right of possession of the offspring of his slaves, now so-called slaves now. All right, so real quick, I just want to show an example of what they're talking about, how you had a contract, you had a certain amount of years you had to work as an indentured servant, and because of these racist and corrupt judges and lawyers at that time, they were actually extending your contract to basically life. So life, you were serving life. Basically, they were turning you into a slave. All right, so I just want to show one court case here from this book, and then we'll go right back to Indian slavery in colonial times. All right, the book we was just reading. All right, so again, we're in the book called Judicial Cases Concerning American Slavery and the Negro. All right, this is from cases from the courts of England, Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky's official document, court records. All right, published by the Carnegie Institution of Washington. Now I want you to look at this court case, right? It says here, Negro, John Punch. That's the hijack Negro. Same thing, American Indian. It says here, the source, page 46. This is July 1640. It says, whereas Hugh Gwynn hath brought back from Maryland 3 servants, formerly run away. The court does therefore order that the said 3 servants shall receive the punishment of whipping, and to have 30 stripes apiece, one called Victor. Now listen to this. Listen to who the 3 servants are. So one of them is Victor, a Dutchman, right? From Holland, a Dutchman, European. The other, a Scotchman, or a Scotland, right? A person from Scotland, a Scotchman, called James Gregory. So 2 Europeans shall first serve out their times with their master according to their indenture. So they got to serve out, their punishment is to serve out their time with their master in 1 whole year apiece after the time of their service is expired, in an extra year, I guess. And after that service, to serve the colony for 3 whole years apiece. So after they serve their master an extra year, then they have to do another additional 3 years for the colony, all right, as servants, indentured servants, all right. And that the third, being a Negro, so the third person, which was a Negro, so-called Negro, right, American Indian, named John Punch, shall serve his said master or his assigns for the time of his natural life, here or elsewhere. You see what's going on? What went on back then is still going on today. So the so-called Negro got life. So he's the one that got life. Why didn't he get just an extra year and then 3 years with the colony? Why didn't he get that same sentence? Because he was a Negro, an Indian? How did he become from indentured servant to basically serving for life? He got life, right? So out of the 3 of them, 2 of them were European. We don't know if they were white Europeans, or if these were, Negro Europeans from this time. We don't know that. All right, so just want you to understand, this is one case example of what they were doing. Eventually your ancestors' contract, would expire, and they wouldn't let them go. They wouldn't meet their contract, the masters. All right, they would let the Scotchman or Dutchman or Irish or whatever, English, free after their time was over. The light skin or white ones, From the standpoint of the slave, it meant little more than the loss of the right to ultimate liberty, political and civil, and the extension of his right to protection and maintenance. So basically they couldn't go to court anymore and fight for their freedom, because they used to go to court all the time when their servitude was up, or being treated wrong or whatever. Many court cases, trust me. All right, so now we're in this book, and it's part of the Johns Hopkins University Studies in Historical and Political Science, and it's called A History of Slavery in Virginia by James Curtis Bala, Associate in History at Johns Hopkins University. All right, 1902. And it says here, for institutional beginnings of the system of American Negro slavery, we are to look then to the Bermudas and to Barbados, rather than to Virginia, Massachusetts, or New York. How far the rules regulating the relation of master and slave in the Spanish colonies influenced the custom and legislation of the English is difficult to determine. The contrast in the 2 resultant slave systems, if it be a safe guide, suggests that if any influence existed between them, it was extremely meager. Some connection, however, is shown between the system of the island and mainland colonies of England, particularly in the influence of Bermudas upon South Carolina. The introduction of the Negro as a profitable labor supply in the English as in the Spanish colonies was the result of a deliberate commercial design, a deliberate commercial design. A London mercantile company, the Company for the Somers Islands. All right, there we go. The Company for the Somers Islands sent in 1616 one of its trading ships to the West Indies for products. All right, so they had a ship, and this is now pay attention, right? This is important. 1616, because these are supposed to be the first so-called African slave that was brought to the Americas or used in 1616, right? So it says that they had this company, the Somers Islands, which King James was involved in. All right, had basically some trading ships that they sent to the West Indies, right? Not Africa, right? They sent to the West Indies. We're gonna read somewhere else. Oh, we know already that it's in Venezuela. They sent. All right, they went to Venezuela, South America. All right, so again, in 1660, one of its trading ships to the West Indies for products, right, such as sugarcane, which they hoped to introduce into Bermudas, and for Negroes to divide for pearls. They went to go look for Negroes in Venezuela in 1616, South America. The first Negro, together with a single Indian and West Indian products. The first Negro, you hear that? So-called Negro. They're just talking about American Indians. Were to be brought back late in the summer of that year. So they went to South America, Venezuela, grabbed some Negroes to die for pearls, and they came back. They called one of them Negro and the other one Indian, and they went back to Bermuda. The relation of the Negro to the profitable cultivation of sugar cane was soon discovered, and fresh importations were made. All right, so we're gonna take a look at this article I found online. It's actually called "Before the Acaniba, the African Colonization of Bermuda, 1616, 1680s," by Dr. Hijack. All right, now it says here, the story of Black presence began 3 years before, with the arrival of Captain Daniel Tucker as governor, the guy we just read, right, about governor, they put it there, of Bermuda under the Summer Islands Company. Bermuda had just 1615 come under the management of the Summer Islands Company management, and he had just arrived on the island as new governor with a commission. That commission, among other things, demanded he order a Mr. Wilmot to go to the Savage Islands, all right, and trade there for things fit for England, as for the plantation, such as cattle, cassava, sugar canes, Negroes, to die for pearls, plants. Bermuda under the Somers Island Company, 2005, Volume 1, page 5. It was the first reference by the company of a need to find specialized black labor for its newly acquired operations in Bermuda. All right, so Dr. Hijack with black, because over here in the original records, as it quoted, it says Negroes. It doesn't say Africans, and we're going to see what they brought back. Well, we already know, but it says, but it was, however, another captain, George Bargrave of the Edwin, who would make history when he left Bermuda in June 1616. He returned in August of that year. So he left Bermuda, right? He left Bermuda. He returned in August of that year with a variety of tropical items, sugarcane, figs, plantains, pineapples, and lignum vitae. But he also returned with one Indian and a Negro. But I thought they told him to go get Negroes so they can die for pearls. Is this one Indian also a Negro? Huh? And who's this Negro? Where does it say he's African? Where in this record does it say he was from Africa? You understand what I'm trying to say and show you? That they've been telling us all our lives that the first so-called African that was put into plantation or slavery or whatever in America was in Bermuda in 1616. Is this account that I'm reading to you guys now? And this is, as far as the trail goes, you're going to see there is no history of this so-called Negro other than this account. How does he lead, or how is he African? So why are they saying he's African the rest of the time? Unless you go to the original records where it just says a Negro and one Indian. All right, so he left from Bermuda, right? And ended up in South America and Venezuela. That's where he got they call it the West Indies, but that's where he got these people. All right, and he went back and brought them to Bermuda in 1616. The latter of which a later governor, Nathaniel Butler, declared was the first these lands ever had. So the first they had. All right, so that's the reference. If Bargrave had carried out what Tucker's commission had commanded of Wilmot, as his other items seem to suggest he had, these two individuals were probably pearl divers, and thus, given the journey of about 2 months, probably originated from the nearest pearling stations in the Americas, the La Margarita, La Cumana operations off the coast of Venezuela. That's where they were coming from, near the Orinoco and Amazon, where we have numerous records, historic accounts of black tribes, so-called black, dark-skinned tribes in this area. All right. So this Negro most likely was American Indian. You got to prove to me this is an African. Stop saying African. All right, just because he's dark skinned doesn't mean he came from Africa. All right. So my whole point of this is to show you that you got to really research things and get to the bottom of it. All right. So again, they came from Venezuela, not from Africa. You can find this in Bermuda under the Summer Islands Company, Volume 1, 2005. Andrews 1978 and Craven in 1990. See also Haywood and Thornton in 2007, Jarvis 2010, Maxwell 1999, and Packwood 1975, if you're not convinced. All right, I'm going to continue with this article. Now listen to this. It says, unlike Virginia and eventually Bermuda, these colonial ventures ultimately failed. Thus, while other English colonial forays into the Atlantic world brought in African captives, the hijack, this black Venezuelan, so-called black, this black Venezuelan pearl diver inaugurated 400 years of a continuous African presence in English North America. Bernard 1999, Haywood and Thornton, that was their opinions. Show me he's an African, because look at what he says here. But he would not be, all right? He would not be, as much as we know about him, the first African-born person in Bermuda. That would happen within a year of his arrival. He is not even African born. All right, so follow me. All right, so now, you know, why did they choose Venezuela? Why did this person go to Venezuela to get pearl divers? How did he know to go there? All right, so let's keep talking about this. I want you to see something. So it says here, the Book of the Pearl, the history, art, science, and industry of the Queen of Gems by George Frederick Kuntz, PhD, Charles Hugh Stevenson, LMM, whatever that means. So New York, this is written in 1908, all right? The Book of the Pearl. All right, so we're in chapter 10 of this book, and it says here, Pearl Fisheries of Venezuela. When I discovered the Indies, I said that they composed the richest country in the world, all right? When I discovered the Indies, the richest country in the world, I spake of gold and pearls and precious stones, and the traffic that might be carried on in them. Extract from Columbus, 4th letter. The Caribbean Sea furnishes one of the most interesting chapters in the history of the pearl fisheries. In no region of the world have these resources caused more rapid exploitation or affected the inhabitants to a greater extent than on the shores of Venezuela. All right, we're talking about the same place where they went and got these so-called Indian and Negro, right? In 1616. All right, so it affected the inhabitants. Who's the inhabitants? We're talking about the aboriginals. They're the indigenous people of that place. Before the discovery of America, the natives, again, the natives, not Africans, of this region collected pearls. So the natives were doing it for hundreds and thousands of years already in that area. All right, the natives of this region collected pearls from the mollusks, which they opened for food in times of necessity, and also sought them for ornamental purposes. And although they had large collections which they used for personal ornamentation and for decorating their temples, it does not appear that they prized them extravagantly, readily bartering from them for small returns. In Columbus' account of his third and fourth voyages to America, he repeatedly refers to pearls. On the third voyage in 1498, after passing the mouth of the Orinoco River, he entered the Gulf of Paria, where the natives came to the ship in their canoes in countless numbers, many of them wearing pieces of gold on their breast, and some with bracelets of pearls on their arms. Seeing this, I was much delighted and made many inquiries with the view of learning where they found them. They replied that they were to be procured in their own neighborhood, and also at a spot to the northward of that place. Continuing the book, it says, this expedition of Pedro Alonso Niño was the first financially profitable voyage to America. And I think we got him in our Columbus and his Negro friends videos. He was actually a dark-skinned European. This is a so-called Negro European. This is Pedro Alonso Niño. All right, so it says that he was the first financially profitable voyage to America. After his return, the Cubagua pearl fishery in Venezuela became the object of numerous speculations, and many other Spaniards fitted out voyages, most of them sailing from Hispaniola or Haiti, 900 miles distant. Owing to the ill treatment of the Indians and excessive cruelties towards them, much difficulty was experienced in securing divers. This was relieved in 1508, listen to this, by transporting large numbers of Indians from Lucayan or Bahama Islands and impressing them into the service. So, how did they get their pearl divers? They got them from the Lucayan or the Bahama Islands, all right? So where does it say these were Africans? All right, so you see where if there was any so-called Negro or anybody being worked there as, divers, it was either the local American Indians that were there doing it for hundreds and thousands of years, or because of how they were treating them, they didn't want to be enslaved or do any more favors for the or trade, with the Spanish or Portuguese. They had to go get other Indians from the Lucayan and Bahama Islands, not Africans, other Indians. All right, so these so-called Negro and American Indian that they went and got from Venezuela that were expert pearl divers, all right, and they brought back to Bermuda, all right. How can we prove that's an African when there's more correlation to show that these are most likely with logic, all right? You can see that these are more likely American Indians, all right? Continuing, it says, these were so expert, we're talking about the Lucayan or Bahama Island people or Indians. These were so expert in the work, we're talking about pearl diving, that individuals sold for upward of 150 ducats each because they were so valuable at pearl diving. With their aid, the fishery prospered so greatly that in 1515 a settlement called New Cadiz was established on Cubagua Island by the governor of Hispaniola, Diego Columbus, son of the discoverer. You hear this? His son got in the pearl business. Alright, Columbus. This small island was dry and desolate, without water or wood, which were brought from the mainland, 20 miles distant from Margarita Island, about 3 miles to the northward. The cupidity of the proprietors of the fishery led to the most cruel treatment of the divers, and if the accounts of the time are to be relied upon, a large percentage of them died under the harsh regimen. About 1515, the unfortunate natives obtained an earnest and influential advocate in Bartolomé de las Casas, who in 1516 prevailed upon the youthful Charles V to decree that the fishery should be prosecuted only in summer, that the divers should not be required to work more than 4 hours a day where the depths exceeded 6 fathoms, that they should receive good nourishment and have a quart of wine daily, should have hammocks or beds in which to sleep, and should be provided with clothes to put on as soon as they left the water. And by later ordinances it was stipulated that death should be inflicted on anyone forcing a free Indian to dive for pearls. All right, it was Indians, not Africans. In 1528, the resources of Coche Island were exploited with so much success that within 6 months, 1,500 marks, 1,200 ounces of pearls were secured. Pearl banks were successfully found at Por la Mar, Maracapana, Curiano, and at various places on the coast, from the Gulf of Paria to the Gulf of Coro, a distance of over 500 miles, which became designated the Pearl Coast. All right. For a number of years previous to 1530, the output exceeded in value of 800,000 pious trees annually, approximating 1/2 of the produce of the American mines at that time. And who was working these mines? Who was diving for all this? This was American Indians. It was largely these pearls that enriched the cargoes of many of those famous caravels that crossed the Atlantic to Spain. Indeed, for several decades, America was best known in continental Europe as the land where the pearls came. So you think it was coincidence that they went from Bermuda to Venezuela to look for expert pearl divers? These were Indians that were working these places for hundreds of years already. It says, look, ruined and lost. It says here, Spanish destruction of the Pearl Coast in the early 16th century. All right, this is from Michael Perry, assistant professor of history in Texas A&M University. All right, it says in the early 16th century, the area that today comprises eastern Venezuela and its offshore islands enriched Spain with pearls, supplied Spanish colonists with Indian slaves, Indian, not Africans, and generated high hopes of finding interior civilizations rich in gold. Gold Coast, Pearl Coast. This is over here, all of that. Guyana, Guinea. Don't play those word games with me. As early as May 1616, right? All right, this is the day we've been talking about, right? 1616. Blacks, so-called blacks, right? It doesn't say Africans. Blacks from the West Indies. Blacks from the West Indies were already at work in Bermuda, providing expert knowledge about the cultivation of tobacco. So you're saying Africans knew about the cultivation of tobacco, an American plant? Who was an expert at cultivating tobacco? Use your common sense. All right, American Indians, right? So these so-called blacks from the West Indies, see how they be wording this? Not only were they providing expert knowledge about cultivation of tobacco, but they were also, right, showing them how to dive for pearls and everything, helping them out with that, right? That's what we've been reading, right? So this is an example of what the hijack does. That's what I'm trying to show you, right? So this is a modern thing. Where's the sources for all this African stuff? In April 1618, Sir Robert Rich, here we go, Robert Rich, right? A prominent member of this company for the Somers Islands and of the Virginia Company, in connection with Deputy Governor Argall of Virginia and other associates, sent a ship under an old commission of the Duke of Savoy, Charles Emmanuel I, to rove in West Indian waters and to prey upon Spanish commerce. These privateers, right? What did they do? They went and took all the servants and slaves that the Spanish had. They calling you property and products, right? They went and took what the Spanish had invaded. They were pirating, and that was American Indians that the Spanish had, the commerce. This ship, Argall, in his private capacity as part owner, fitted out in Virginia, ostensibly for trade with the Indians on the coast and among the islands for skins and goats, though his real object was piracy upon Spanish commerce. The real purpose of these ships, this company, was to pirate Spanish colonies, ships, and everything. The Spanish were enslaving American Indians, not Africans. This was what they were pirating off of the Spanish. On its course to the West Indies, the treasurer, famous ship we're gonna hear, touched at the Bermudas, and Deputy Governor Kendall, contrary to the order and advice of Governor Tucker, who was just leaving for England and feared diplomatic complications with Spain, received the ship ostensibly as the Earl of Warwick's. He even provided it with provisions and other necessaries from the public store, on condition of being admitted to a share of its plunder as a rover, a fact which was now candidly admitted. The result of its voyage was a cargo of negroes. You hear that? So they went and raided all these Spanish colonies and ships in the West Indies, in South America, Central America. That's what they were doing. These are the real pirates of the Caribbean. This is what they were doing. And what did they came back with? The result of its voyage was a cargo of Negroes, so-called Negroes. The Spanish had American Indians in an encomienda system. All right, we saw the other past videos, right? Who were they really enslaving? With which it returned to Virginia in the fall of 1619. All right, so this is the first so-called 20-odd Negroes that came in 1619. They actually took it from a ship in off the coast of Veracruz, New Mexico, in the Caribbean, in a Spanish ship. And that was American Indians they had in there. Yearly having succeeded Argall in the government, and the Virginians being afraid of trouble with Spain and the treasurer and its mission were thoroughly discontented by the colony. The rover therefore sailed away secretly for the Bermudas after landing at Jamestown with a single Negro, and that one probably because she was a woman. The remainder of the cargo, 29 Negroes, were taken to the Bermudas early in September of 1619. Shortly before this, a Dutch frigate, manned chiefly with English, a consort of the treasurer, and pretending to sail under a commission of the Duke of Orange. So these ships, right, these pirate ships, all right, so you understand what's going on. The Duke of Savoy, Duke of Orange, they got Dutch plates on them, and they're like flying with Dutch flags. That's how they're covering up their piracy, the English. So they hire privateers or pirates to go do it under the Dutch names, under Dutch, like they look like they're representing, like these are Dutch ships basically, or Dutch people. So again, pretending to sail under a commission of the Duke of Orange, but actually uncommissioned and hence a pirate. All right, a pirate had presented Governor Kendall of the Bermudas with 14 Negroes and other plunder captured in the West Indies, not in Africa. They kept bringing all these English pirates, all these colonists. Every time they would bring up ships full of so-called Negroes from the Spanish, they were in the West Indies, never in Africa. If we know the true history of the Spanish and Portuguese, we'll see that they were really enslaving or had the Indians in an encomienda system. All right, I've shown you the history behind it. There's more records telling us a reverse transatlantic voyage from here to Europe to West Africa, and other parts of the world, in exchange for provisions and munitions. The exchange was made on the misunderstanding that Kendall was to share in the results of its further depredations. This ship, before coming to Bermudas, had touched at Jamestown about the last of August 1619, and sold the colonists 20 Negroes. All right, they sold the colonists 20 Negroes. It doesn't say here Africans. Remember, they're calling you Negro, American Indian. These were the first Negroes introduced into the colony of Virginia. All right, that's your own hijack. You were already there. You've been there since creation. All right, these were just other Indians, other Negroes. That's why when they describe them, they say, oh, these are odd Negroes. What do they mean by that? Because they know the Negroes there locally, because they see the Indians all around them, right? So when they saw other Indians coming up, so imagine they're coming from Veracruz. They could have been coming from the mainland Mexico. Could these be Aztec Mayas? Imagine what they got on, the different gear, the different, the clothing and everything, the pierced nose, and everything's different. So they're not used to seeing these type of so-called Negroes, right? So when they get to Virginia, they're like, oh, 20 odd Negroes arrived. They don't say Africans in any of these old original records. They say Negroes. That's not a race. That's not a people. That's not a nation. That's just a description of people's complexion, right? All right, we're in the PBS.org website, PBS. And it says here, indentured servants in the U.S. Learn more about indentured servants. And just look at the picture, right? Look who they're showing right here in this picture. But when they're talking, they ain't mentioning, they're just talking about European indentured servants. Indentured servants first arrived in America in the decade following the settlement of Jamestown by the Virginia Company in 1607. The idea of indentured servitude was born of a need for cheap labor. The earliest settlers soon realized that they had lots of land to care for, but no one to care for it. With passage to the colonies, expensive for all but the wealthy, the Virginia Company developed a system of indentured servitude to attract workers. Indentured servants became vital to the colonial economy. The timing of the Virginia colony was ideal. The 30-year wars had left Europe's economy depressed, and many skilled and unskilled laborers were without work. A new life in the New World offered a glimpse of hope. This explains how 1/2 to 2/3 of the immigrants who came to the American colonies arrived as indentured servants. All right, so why are they showing only this picture? Where's the so-called white Europeans? I want to go down to this part right here. It says, in 1619, the first black Africans came to Virginia, because I want to show you how they word things. Right here in pbs.org, they're telling you, first black Africans. What does this mean? So in 1619, the first black Africans came to Virginia. With no slave laws in place, they were initially treated as indentured servants and given the same opportunities for freedom dues as whites. However, slave laws were soon passed in Massachusetts in 1641 and in Virginia in 1661. And any small freedoms that might have existed for so-called blacks were taken away. So-called black, crayon color.
So this article is called The Illegal Beginning of American Negro Slavery. Again, the illegal beginning of American Negro slavery. So the way I found this journal, right, it was from one of those references in Wikipedia, those little numbers, and I went to it and it gave me a whole book. And then in the book there's it's a magazine, right? This magazine is written from the American Bar Association, right? That's with lawyers, right? With the lawyers have to study and pass the bar exam. This is not just any institute. This is the American Bar Association. This was a journal from that magazine, volume number 56. This was from January 1970, pages 45 to 49. I had to take screenshots of it so I can have these pages, and I created a PDF out. But it's such a good study and research, and it's proof. It's basically these are lawyers writing this, right? There's no bullshit in this. So let's start right away. Now it says, all Englishmen treasured their birthright of freedom, and for 100 years they looked with scorn on the Spanish New World venture to which slavery was so integral. Yet the Negroes brought to America, after a brief equivocal period during which their fate, tethered between freedom and slavery, would fall into a form of total chattel slavery, peculiar to the North American continent and described by Professor Herbert S. Klein as a degraded as any in Western civilization. So they're telling us, we gotta dodge the high ground, that these Negroes brought to America. They're not telling us they were brought from Africa, but they're assuming that, I'm sure. So they're telling us that the slavery that was already here was much different than what they introduced, this new type of system, this new type of slavery, which was very degraded in any Western civilization, as Herbert S. Klein just said. So let's read about this, chattel slavery, right? In the case of Virginia, the fate of the Negro was sealed as total chattel slavery by 1662, 43 years after the arrival of the first Negroes in Jamestown. Now again, stop right there. These first Negroes in Jamestown, right? They're talking about these 20 odd Negroes. They call them odd Negroes. Now, in history, when we were little in school, they used to tell us that they were bringing these ships straight from Africa. But when you do the research, and please do the research, you'll see that they were actually taking these Negroes, or so-called Negroes, right? These Indians, from Spanish ships. They were pirates. These English ships were pirate ships. They had even Dutch names. They used to change the names because England supposedly had outlawed slavery, so they had to kind of use a different AKA, right? AKA Dutch ship, right? So they actually got these Negroes that came into Jamestown in 1619 from the coast of Veracruz in the Caribbean. That's where the ship was pirated, and that's where they brought the Negroes from. So there is no evidence that it was brought from West Africa or Ghana, as the Spanish were saying. So let's continue. What forces conspired during these 4 decades to produce this incredible aberration in the great Anglo-American tradition of freedom? One thing is certain: slavery was originally illegal in Virginia and the other English colonies. The first charter granted James I to the Virginia Company in 1606, right? King James also is given credit for the Bible, right? Authoring, these new versions of the Bible in English. It says, he recited that all colonists shall have and enjoy all liberties, franchises, and immunities within any of other dominions, to all intents and purposes, as if they had been abiding and born within the realm of England. So he's saying that they gave these people, these colonists, these white Europeans, basically English citizenship, even though they were being born in America. Continuing, the accompanying royal orders directed the Council of the Virginia Company to follow the common law and the equity thereof. In 1609, a revised charter placed Virginia under the king as of our manor of East Greenwich, and reiterated that colonists should enjoy all liberties of Englishmen as if they dwelt within the English realm. Most of the early so-called Negro arrivals at Jamestown were former slaves pirated from New Spain. Again, pirated, not from Africa. They were taken from Spanish ships, but there was no institutional basis for enslaving them in Virginia. So they couldn't just slave them like the Spanish were doing, right? They had to do it a certain way. They had to be slick about it. So these early blacks entered a legal limbo in which there coalesced certain fateful forces, some internal, some external, some by happenstance, but some by very foul design. Yet these forces could not have resulted in any slavery but for the astonishing silence of 17th century English lawyers, judges, and public officials on both sides of the Atlantic. During this conspiracy of silence, the colonists borrowed the institution of slavery from the vastly different culture and jurisprudence of Spain, adapting it to their own uses. So they introduced these so-called Negroes, these Indians that they were taken from the Caribbean or anywhere else, South America, wherever they were coming from, and they had to introduce them as forced labor workers or indentured servers, indentured slaves, right? And they had eventually, because of the corruptness of these people, these racist English Europeans, judges, lawyers, because we're gonna read how these Negroes, after they served their term, they were suing, they were going to court because they wouldn't let them go. But these lawyers and English judges were ignoring all of this. Alright? So continuing, it says, see no evil, hear no evil. The initial illegality of slavery in the English colonies does not imply an unfamiliarity in the institution. When Jamestown was founded in 1607, New Spain had been a thriving enterprise in the Caribbean for about 100 years, and slavery was part of New Spain from its beginning. Unlike England, Spain had a tradition of slavery dating back to the Moors, when Muslim and Christian in turn enslaved one another. A body of Spanish jurisprudence, therefore, existed relating to the rights and obligations of a master and a slave. The Spanish slave enjoyed the rights to marriage and other family rights. Manumission was officially encouraged, and cruel punishment was illegal. Thus, the slave in New Spain remained a person in legal cognizance, in contrast to the English colonies, where he ultimately became a chattel with no rights in legal cognizance.
So remember, these first 69 were indentured servants. The governor that you heard in the beginning of the video was not lying. He knows history. You see how the news try to fool you, the viewer, right? And that's why people get a bunch of followers, because they're being brainwashed. All right, propaganda and the news, they want to control your opinions. So he said what he said. He knows what he's talking about. I'm reading from Judicial Cases Concerning American Slavery and the Negro, book. These are from court cases. This is an official book. Official. You see all these little numbers right here, They got sources. Go, you can research. Go look for this book online, just like I found it. All right? And go look at all the sources. Verify it. You can see this is actual history. All right? These were indentured servants. I guess, again, I'll read that part. So they all of a sudden, from supposedly slaves, because the Spanish didn't have slaves either, they had encomiendas. which was just like an indentured servitude system, encomienda, that they put the American Indians in. All right. So it says that it became servitude analogous to that of the indentured white servants. These first 20 so-called Negroes that came to Comfort Point in Virginia, not Jamestown, in Comfort Point, were indentured servants. Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States by Almond Wheeler, Lauber, Ph.D. The legislation which marked the change in status varied in nature in the several colonies. In certain colonies, the slavery status was simply recognized as being in existence by certain acts relating to slaves, without any formal declaration of the effect that Indians held in servitude should be considered slaves. In other colonies, the condition of slavery, as applied to Indians, was legalized by general acts relating to slavery in general, and not specifying either Indians or Negroes, because it's all the same. They didn't need to specify in those times, they knew it. And still other colonies, the holding of Indians in a condition of actual slavery was legalized by legislative acts relating directly to Indians. An act of this latter character was passed by New York in 1678, declaring that all Indians that should come to or be brought into the province at any time during the succeeding 6 months should be sold as slaves for the benefit of the government. South Carolina, in an act of 1712 relating to the better ordering and governing of Negroes and slaves, are they adding Indians in there? You know they are. Provided that all Negroes, mulattoes, mestizos, or Indians which have at any time heretofore been sold, or now are held and taken to be, or hereafter shall be brought and sold as slaves, are hereby declared slaves to all intents and purposes, excepting all such Negroes, mulattoes, mestizos, or Indians which heretofore have been or hereafter shall be for some particular merit made and declared free, either by the governor and council of this province, or by their respective owners and masters, and also excepting all such Negroes, mulattoes, mestizos, or Indians as can prove they ought not to be sold as slaves. All right, so you heard that. So see how they group all those tags together all the time, right? Because it's all the same people, really, most of it. All right, I would say at least 98% of those people are all the same people. All right, and so they're trying to say that, only the governor, the council, and your master can, let you go free. If you came in as a slave, then you will be considered a slave. That's what they're saying. If you came in with that status, you're going to consider that. The acts already mentioned in other connections, authorizing the enslavement of Indian captives taken in war, the holding in slavery of such captives, when obtained in trade from sources outside the colony, and the enslavement of free Indians by the colonial authorities as punishment for misdemeanors and crimes are also cases in points. All right. From the standpoint of English law, the action of the colonial legislatures enacting the slavery status had no legal sanction. It was based on the interpretation of the common law of nations. Again, whoa, let's go back to that. You hear this? So we're talking about the statute of slavery, of the term slavery and by law, right, and all that. So it says, from the standpoint of English law, the action of the colonial legislatures enacting the slavery status had no legal sanction. No legal sanction. It was based on the interpretation of the common law of nations. That is, it was carried on in accordance with a law not promulgated by legislation, and rested upon prevalent views of universal jurisprudence, or the law of nations, supported by the express or implied authority of the home government. Concerning the institution of slavery, what is the home government? Are we talking about the Vatican? So the colonies, by a gradual process of changing conditions and legal enactments, substituted the slavery status for the servitude status, without molestation from the home government, which was interested in colonial slave conditions and legislation only when the African slave trade was involved. So long, therefore, as the enactment of colonial laws decreeing the slavery status did not interfere with that trade, the home government gave no attention to the matter. As for Indian slavery, if England had given it any attention whatever, she would probably have considered it a purely colonial matter. It was never sufficiently extensive to interfere with Negro slavery and the slave trade. There you go. This is what they really wanted to say, because before they just said African, right? So now they said Negro slavery. As long as it didn't mess with what they were doing in the other parts of America, that's what they're saying, and the slave trade. It never received any attention from the home government, and so existed as legal because never declared illegal. It was never declared illegal. An authority on the legal status of early American slavery states, it may be laid down as a legal axiom that in all governments in which the municipal regulations are not absolutely opposed to slavery, persons already reduced to that state may be held in it, and we also assume as a first principle that slavery had been permitted and tolerated in all the colonies established in America by European powers, as relates to blacks and also as relates to Indians in the first periods of conquest and colonization. This account in a measure for the absence of any legislative act of European powers for introducing slavery into the American dominions. Hence, it followed that the English colonial charters authorizing the colonial legislatures to make laws gave no license as such to enslave. Again, you hear that? So based on what they're saying right here, this accounts and measure again for the absence of any legislative act of European powers for intruding slavery into the American dominions. So then they didn't have laws, right, to go against anything like this, right? So they were just creating. So it's like going around the system a little bit. So it says, hence it followed that the English colonial charters authorizing the colonial legislatures to make laws gave no license as such to enslave. All right, we're still in the book Indian Slavery in Colonial Times within the present limits of the United States. And it says here, with the change from the status of servitude to the status of slavery, certain of the attributes of the former condition were continued and connected with the latter. Chief of these, and the fundamental idea on which the change was effected, was the conception of property right, which from the idea of the ownership of an individual's service resting upon contract implied or expressed came to be that of the ownership of an individual's person. Indian slaves were recognized as property in all English colonies and were openly bought and sold at both public and private sales, like Negroes and other property. Again, Indian slaves were recognized as property in all the English colonies. All right. So, all those images we get, growing up of so-called Negroes, only so-called Negroes or whatever we think is a Negro or whatever we think is an Indian, right? They never tell us, that they were being sold both in public and private sales, just like Negroes, as it says here, and other property. The same people. They were advertised in the colonial newspapers with statements of their qualifications and ability for work, their ages, and sometimes descriptions of their personal appearance. From the New England newspapers, it is apparent that for a time, dealers advertised such slaves for sale openly in their own names. Later, the possible purchaser was directed by the advertisement to inquire of the printer and no further, or to inquire at the post office. It was not uncommon for slaves offered for sale to choose their future owner from those who desired to purchase them or to approve the bill of sale. You hear that? Got to choose your owner, your master. Like other property, real or personal, Indian slaves could be given away by word of mouth or by last will and testament. One of the earliest of such wills on record is that of Governor John Winthrop of Massachusetts, John Winthrop, made in 1639, by which he gave to his son Adam, Governor's Island, and with it also my Indians thereon. All right, his Indians, that's who he had as servants or slaves, all right, or property, not what you call Africans, right? He had Indians. In South Carolina, where Indian slaves were most numerous, the records of their disposal by will are frequent, most numerous in South Carolina. The custom, in fact, was universal in the colonies. It was universal throughout the colonies. Indian slaves were listed in the various colonies in the inventories of a state, along with indentured servants of unexpired terms and Negro slaves. They were taken like other chattel in payment for debt, and in certain of the colonies provision was made by law regarding the matter. South Carolina, February 7, 1690, decreed that a slave was to be taken like any other chattel as payment for debt. Maryland in 1729 passed an act to the effect that no slave should be taken for any debt due from the deceased so long as there should be any other goods sufficient for the purpose. In those colonies where legislation makes no mention of the matter, it is known from the history of Negro slavery that the custom was similar to that of Carolina. The proximity of the Indian tribes to the colonists, furthermore, afforded a condition most suitable for the escape of Indian slaves. Individual testimony, frequent advertisements in the colonial newspapers giving descriptions of fugitive Indian slaves and offering rewards for their capture and return, and the amount of colonial legislation concerning both Negro and Indian runaway slaves showed that Indians held in servitude took frequent advantage of the opportunities at hand for their escape. We've gone over this right in the last video and I've shown you advertisements from those times talking about the Indian Negro of the Indian breed, or Negro with long hair, bright yellow Negro, right? Like, these are Indians. Most of these advertisements were for Indians. Who else would be running away? How else would Harriet Tubman know the routes? The Underground Railroad, right? All right, Aboriginal. These are old ancient routes, right? Now it says here, and that their owners used all possible means to regain their lost property. At the time following the Pequot War, Mason complained of the tendency to run away shown by the Pequot slaves in the colonies. The Indians enslaved after King Philip's War likewise escaped. Mayhew tells of runaway Indian slaves in Massachusetts in 1690. In this same year, one Isaac Morrill of New Jersey was arrested at Newbury, Massachusetts, for enticing Indian and Negro slaves to run away. The Boston News Letter came into existence in 1704, at about the time when Indian slaves began to be brought into the northern colonies from the Spanish islands and from the Carolinas. What? Who? Indian slaves, not Africans. Indians in 1704. This is way after 1619, right? So-called first Africans, right? We're going to talk about all that. All right, but since the existence of 1704, right? This is during the time that they were receiving Indian slaves from the Spanish islands and from the Carolinas. Rarely was there an issue of that or the other Massachusetts newspapers. From that time down to the Revolutionary period, which did not contain an advertisement for a runaway Indian slaves. This is all about you, so-called Negroes. It's all the same people. Sometimes the same advertisement was repeated in 2 or 3 successive issues and was often inserted in more than one newspaper. For the capture and return of the fugitives, rewards were offered, sometimes indefinite in nature as suitable rewards, sometimes of stated amounts of £3, 40 shillings, 20 shillings, £6, 20 pounds, £5, 7 pounds, 15 pounds, 4 pistoles, 50 shillings. These advertisements relate for the most part to fugitive men and boy Indian slaves, but advertisements relating to runaway women Indian slaves are not lacking. The escapees appear for the most part, though not always, to have been made singly. One advertisement shows 2 Indian men, 2 Indian women, and an Indian boy belonging to a different person to have escaped together. Captains of vessels were often cautioned in the advertisements against carrying away such fugitives, slaves, and any person harboring them or aiding them to escape was threatened with full penalty of the law. All the colonies enacted fugitive slave laws. Some of these laws were applied to slaves in general, some to Negroes and other slaves, still others to Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves. The colonies where slavery the colonies where slavery was of greatest extent had the most extensive and elaborate laws on the subject, and those colonies where Indian slavery existed to any considerable extent included the term Indian slaves in their laws. Pennsylvania made but little provision regarding runaway slaves. Maryland concerned itself more largely with servants. Some of these laws did not define the term runaway slave. Others, in an attempt to avoid confusion, gave clear explanations of the term. Such an act was passed by Connecticut in 1690, specifying that any Indian, mulatto, or Negro servant and slaves wandering outside the place to which they belong without a ticket or leave or pass in writing from some assistant or justice of the peace or from their owner were to be considered runaways and treated as such. New Jersey in 1713 considered as runaways any Negro, mulatto, or Indian slave who was 5 miles from his master's habitation without written leave of absence from his owner, and any such slave found in New Jersey, but belonging to another province was declared a runaway. South Carolina, by the Act of 1690, considered as a runaway any Negro or Indian slave absent from his master's plantation, no distance specified, without a written ticket of leave unless in company with a white man. To discourage aid and assistance being given fugitive slaves, the colony specified by legislative acts that punishment to follow such offense. On June 14, 1705, Lord Cornbury, in his opening speech to the New York Assembly, expressed his opinion regarding the necessity for passing an act to prevent Negro, Indian, and mulatto slaves running away from their masters. An act of the Common Council of Albany, 1686, forbade all persons harboring Negro or Indian slaves in their houses without the owner's consent. Pennsylvania, 1726, decreed a fine of 5 shillings for the first hour and 1 shilling for every hour afterwards that any person should harbor or entertain any runaway Negro, Indian, or mulatto slave. Virginia, by the Act of 1705, specified a fine of £100 for any shipmaster transporting any Negro, mulatto, or Indian slave out of the colony without permission of the owner. Alright, so do you see how they always just group in Negro, mulatto, and Indian all together? They keep mentioning, you see, so it was all, but these three are all the same people. They were calling the Indians mulatto and Negro in census records. They would change that. We know that, right? So South Carolina also, by an act of 1690, levied 40 shillings fine on anyone not attempting to apprehend a Negro or Indian slave coming into his plantation without a ticket or of leave from his master or not accompanied by a white man. Not infrequently, the colonial authorities were called upon to furnish protection to the owners of Indian slaves against their seizure by the free Indians or against fugitive Indian slaves being hidden and retained by the tribes. To effect the return of such slaves, special inducements were offered by the colonial government from time to time. At the close of the Pequot War, an agreement was made by the chief Mayantonomo and the Massachusetts government, by which the former promised to seize such Pequot slaves as escaped and return them to their owners.
Alright, I think we'll end this video right here. I still have a lot more information to present to you guys. Again, this part of the investigation and research we're doing will probably take another 2 videos so I can put all the information out, but these next 2 are coming right away. I have most of it already edited. So I just want to remind everyone, what we discussed so far, though, so when we get to the next parts, we can remember, right? Which are very important. They tell us that the first so-called Negro or African used as a slave in any English colony was in 1616 in Bermuda. We know now that he was a so-called black Venezuelan, as they were calling him in some records, right? But he's an Indigenous American Indian, is what they really mean. We know that they were the ones diving for pearls for thousands and thousands of years there in Venezuela, and that's where everybody was getting their pearls. The English knew the Spanish were using Indians, so they went and
did the same. They went and got some Indians to fish for pearls for them. That's what they set up their whole company to do, is basically copy and mimic what the Spanish were doing so they can be successful, just like the Spanish and Portuguese were being successful. All right. And then we also know that Virginia did not make slavery legal by statute until 1661. So meaning that any so-called slaves, as they were calling them, or they teach us, right, before that were actually indentured servants. They were indentured servants, like the governor said in the beginning of this video. Like we're going to prove to you, like we've mentioned it in different articles. We're going to continue to read the illegal beginning of Negro slavery. All right, it's going to tell you straight up who they were as well and their status. All right, so remember, they actually came from pirated Spanish ships in the Caribbean off the coast of Veracruz, not from Africa. Alright, so there's so many lies on top of lies, it becomes, you know, a fiction. It becomes a fairy tale. But hope you continue to part 19 and 20. Yeah, we're going to continue to break this down even more. So, you know, stay tuned. Again, thanks for being here. And, you know, very important, know who you are. You're a POW, not a descendant of a slave.